I want to tell you something your rational mind will immediately push back against. Something that, at first hearing, will feel wrong, almost impossible to accept. Because if it were true, it would completely overturn the story you've been telling yourself about what happened in that connection. It would mean that what you interpreted as indifference, detachment, or lack of care was actually something far more complicated. Not the absence of feeling, but the overflow of it in a system that doesn't know how to hold it. In this framework, the deeper an avoidant becomes emotionally invested, the more dysregulated their behavior can appear. And I need you to hear this clearly. The intensity of their withdrawal often rises in direct proportion to how much you actually matter to them. Let that land for a moment. The distancing that showed up right when things started to feel real. The sudden coldness that replaced warmth without warning. The emotional pullback that felt random, inconsistent, and almost surreal. All of it wasn't necessarily a sign of decreasing attachment. In many cases, it was the nervous system reacting to increasing attachment. And I've spent years observing this pattern across different relationships, seeing the same cycle repeat itself. Deep confusion on one side and automatic protective shutdown on the other. The person on the receiving end is left trying to decode behavior that feels personal, while the one enacting it is often not fully conscious of why they're reacting that way. That's why it's so important to understand what's actually happening beneath the surface. Because if you keep interpreting the experience through the wrong lens, you keep carrying unnecessary emotional damage long after the relationship ends. Most explanations of avoidant behavior stay at the psychological level. Thought patterns, habits, attachment styles, learned coping mechanisms. Those are part of it, but they don't go deep enough. The more accurate layer is physiological. It is rooted in the nervous system. At that level, avoidance is not just a preference for space or independence. It is a conditioned survival response. In early development, the nervous system of an avoidant individual often learns to associate closeness with danger, not through conscious reasoning, but through repeated emotional experiences where reaching for connection led to discomfort, rejection, inconsistency, or emotional overwhelm. The nervous system doesn't interpret these moments logically. It records them as patterns. It learns closeness equals risk. Vulnerability equals loss of control. Emotional dependence equals pain. So over time, it becomes highly efficient at one thing, preventing emotional proximity from reaching the point where that old pain might be reactivated. When intimacy starts to deepen in adulthood, that old programming doesn't stay dormant. It activates. Not because the present moment is dangerous in a real sense, but because the nervous system is predicting danger based on past experience. So what gets triggered isn't a calm emotional realization of, I'm falling in love. Instead, it's a physiological alarm state. The body reacts first, before any conscious thought can form. And in that state, the system moves into protection mode. It creates distance. It shuts down emotional availability. It numbs out connection. Not as a strategic decision, but as an automatic response to perceived threat. What makes this so painful for the other person is the contrast. In the beginning, when emotional intensity is still within a tolerable range, the avoidant can appear open, attentive, even deeply affectionate. Those moments are real. They are not fake, and they are not manipulation. They reflect who they are when their nervous system feels safe enough to stay engaged. But as emotional depth increases, a threshold is eventually crossed. And that threshold is not psychological, it is biological. From the avoidant's internal experience, that crossing does not feel like love expanding in a stable way. It feels like activation, overload, pressure, a loss of internal equilibrium. Their system no longer reads closeness as comforting. It reads it as engulfing. At that point, the body reacts as if it needs escape. Heart rate rises, emotional clarity decreases. The urge to withdraw becomes overwhelming. Distance suddenly feels like the only way to regulate the internal state again. And so the shift happens. Warmth turns into withdrawal. Presence turns into absence. Closeness turns into emotional distance that seems to appear out of nowhere. But from the inside, it is not random at all. It is a predictable survival response based on a nervous system that equates emotional intimacy with threat once a certain depth is reached. And importantly, this is not a conscious choice. It is not a moral failure or intentional harm. It is an automatic defense pattern running faster than reflection, shaped long before the current relationship ever existed. Understanding this doesn't erase the pain of what you experienced, but it does reframe it. It shifts the meaning from rejection to dysregulation, from indifference to overwhelm, from lack of love to fear of it becoming too real. It is the body's defense system doing the only thing it has learned to do when emotional intensity crosses a threshold it associates with danger. Now I want to slow this down and get very specific about what this actually looks like in real life. Because the most painful part of this experience is not just what happened, it's how easily it gets misread. And that misreading is often what turns a temporary relational pattern into a long-term wound in your self-perception. There are distinct ways this protective shutdown tends to show up, and recognizing them clearly can change how you interpret what you went through. The first is the sudden disappearance of emotional availability without warning. One moment, the connection feels alive. There is warmth, responsiveness, and a sense of genuine emotional presence that makes everything feel mutual and real. Then, almost abruptly, that presence is gone. It is replaced by distance, not gradually, not subtly, but like an internal switch has been flipped. What makes this so destabilizing is the contrast. You are still emotionally standing in the warmth of what was there just hours or days ago, while the other person is no longer accessible in the same way. From the outside, it feels inconsistent. From the inside of the avoidance system, it is protective logic kicking in. The emotional warmth of the previous interaction didn't disappear, it was registered. And once it registers as "this is becoming important," the nervous system begins to anticipate risk. So the distance that appears is not necessarily a reaction to you in the present moment. It is often a reaction to what the connection is becoming in significance. The system moves to reduce emotional exposure before the anticipated pain of deeper attachment can take hold. The second form is the creation of friction where there was previously ease. This is one of the most confusing shifts to experience because it feels like revision. Things you never thought were issues suddenly become points of tension. Qualities that were once appreciated start to be questioned. Small behaviors become emotionally loaded. It can leave you feeling like you're being evaluated by a moving standard you were never informed of. What is happening here is not necessarily conscious criticism. It is a psychological attempt to restore distance. When someone begins to matter more than the nervous system can comfortably regulate, the mind starts searching for ways to reduce the emotional weight of that bond. If flaws can be identified, if imperfections can be amplified, then the emotional intensity becomes easier to justify pulling away from. The mind creates reasons that make distance feel logical instead of purely reactive. This is why it can feel like the person you knew is suddenly assessing you differently. It is less about who you are becoming and more about how their internal system is trying to restabilize itself. The third form is the withdrawal of the very qualities that made the bond feel most intimate. In many avoidant dynamics, the early connection is marked by a specific kind of attention. There is often a depth of observation, a sharp emotional awareness, or a unique presence that makes you feel unusually seen. That experience can feel rare, even defining. But as emotional intensity increases, that same quality often begins to fade. The attentiveness becomes reduced. The emotional clarity becomes muted. The sense of being fully seen is replaced with something more controlled, more cautious, more distant. And this is where the emotional confusion becomes most intense for the other person, because you are not just losing contact. You are losing a specific kind of contact that felt meaningful and irreplaceable. So you naturally try to restore it. You reach for what was there before. You try to recreate the conditions that brought that version of them forward. But from the avoidant side, that very reaching reinforces the sense of pressure, and the nervous system responds by increasing distance again. This creates a loop. The more you reach for closeness, the more the system perceives activation, and the more it pulls away to regulate itself. And in that loop, it becomes easy for you to conclude that you did something wrong, that you lost something because of a personal failing, that the shift in their behavior is evidence of your diminishing value. But that interpretation is where the deepest harm often forms. So I want to pause here and be very direct about something important. Understanding this pattern is not the same as excusing it, and recognizing a nervous system response does not mean you are required to tolerate its impact on you indefinitely. There is a real risk in misusing this kind of explanation. If it is misunderstood, it can turn into justification for staying in situations where you are repeatedly emotionally destabilized. That is not what this framework is for. The purpose of understanding is not to soften what happened. It is to clarify it. Because without clarity, the mind often builds a narrative that turns the experience inward. It starts to suggest that the escalation of distance means you were becoming less worthy of love. That as intimacy increased, something about you became harder to hold. That story is not only painful, it is inaccurate. What actually tends to happen is almost the opposite of that interpretation. The more emotionally real the connection becomes, the more it activates attachment fear in an unregulated system. And the more that fear is activated, the more defensive behaviors begin to appear. So the shift in treatment is not evidence of your diminishing value. It is evidence of increasing emotional significance colliding with a system that cannot sustain it safely. And that distinction matters because it directly challenges the belief many people walk away with that being fully seen leads to being rejected. In reality, what this pattern shows is something very different. Being fully seen can sometimes activate fear in someone whose internal system equates emotional closeness with loss of control or impending emotional pain. The difficulty is not your depth. It is the system's capacity to stay present with depth. And finally, it is important to say this clearly. These patterns are not fixed identities. They are adaptive responses. They can shift when there is awareness, reflection, and sustained internal work. They are not destiny. But whether or not they change, your responsibility in the present moment remains the same. To recognize what dynamic you are in, and to decide what level of emotional unpredictability is acceptable for you. Because understanding the mechanism is not meant to keep you inside it. It is meant to help you finally see it for what it is. It is a learned pattern, and anything learned can, in principle, be unlearned. A nervous system that has been conditioned to interpret closeness as danger is not fixed in that state forever. Through sustained corrective experiences, emotional safety, and deep internal work, it can gradually begin to form a different association. Love can start to register not as threat, but as stability. not as impending loss, but as something that can be held without collapse. But this kind of change is neither simple nor quick. It does not happen because someone wants to be different. It does not happen because they meet someone who loves them intensely enough. And it certainly does not happen because another person patiently absorbs the consequences of their dysregulation. Wanting change and having the capacity to do the work of change are two completely different realities. Real transformation requires sustained self-awareness, emotional endurance, and a willingness to remain present with discomfort rather than escaping it. And the very defenses that form around avoidant patterns are designed to interrupt that process the moment it becomes too activating. So it is important to hold both truths at the same time. Change is possible, and it is also difficult in a way that cannot be outsourced. There are cases where avoidant patterns do shift, where people do engage in real therapeutic work, develop emotional tolerance, and slowly build the capacity to stay present in intimacy without reflexively withdrawing. That capacity can be developed. It does exist. But it requires something very specific: the decision to prioritize growth over protection. And for many people, that decision only becomes available after enough emotional consequence accumulates that the cost of the pattern finally outweighs the comfort of maintaining it. And this is where your place in that dynamic becomes critical to understand. You are not responsible for producing that change in someone else. You cannot accelerate it through patience. You cannot stabilize it through love. You cannot teach a nervous system to feel safe by continuously sacrificing your own sense of safety in the process. Many people attempt exactly that. They hold on with extraordinary empathy, believing that consistency, understanding, and emotional endurance will eventually soften the pattern. But what often happens instead is not transformation. It is depletion. The partner becomes increasingly exhausted while the underlying system remains unchanged. Because the work of rewiring is internal. It cannot be done through proximity to someone else's love. It begins only when the person themselves decides they can no longer live inside the same repeating cycle. So what remains within your control is not whether they change, but whether you stay inside a dynamic that is actively impacting your emotional stability in the present. And that is a question that does not require prediction. It requires honesty. Not about who they might become someday, not about what is possible in theory, but about what is actually happening now. How you feel in the relationship as it exists, not as it could exist under ideal conditions. If the present pattern is eroding your sense of clarity, self-trust, or emotional grounding, then that information is already enough. You do not need further justification to take it seriously. Clarity does not require perfect certainty. It only requires recognition of impact. And recognizing impact is often the point where everything becomes simpler, even if not easier. Because it shifts the focus away from trying to solve the other person's internal world and back to where your responsibility has always actually been. Your own experience, your own boundaries, your own emotional continuity. It is also important to release one of the most damaging conclusions people carry away from these dynamics. When someone becomes inconsistent as emotional depth increases, it is easy to interpret that as evidence that you were too much, or that something about your real self caused the withdrawal. But that conclusion does not hold up under closer examination. What tends to happen instead is that increased emotional closeness activates an internal alarm system in the other person. The response is not a measured evaluation of your worth. It is a physiological and emotional shift driven by perceived overwhelm. And in that state, protective strategies override relational presence. So the change in behavior is not a reflection of your diminishing value. It is a reflection of their decreasing capacity in the face of increasing emotional intensity. That distinction matters deeply, because without it, people often internalize the wrong lesson, that being fully known leads to being rejected. But the more accurate truth is different. Being fully known does not inherently push love away. It only destabilizes those whose system has learned to associate being deeply known with emotional risk. And that is not a measure of your inadequacy. It is a measure of their capacity. None of this erases what you went through. It does not soften the confusion or the pain of being met with distance where there was once connection. But it does reframe the meaning you attach to it, because the interpretation you carry forward will either shrink you or restore you. One story says, "I become harder to love when I am fully seen." The other says, "My depth revealed a limit in someone else's capacity to stay present with depth." Only one of those stories turns you against yourself. And over time, the difference between those narratives becomes the difference between repeating the same emotional pattern and stepping out of it. What remains true, regardless of the pattern, is this: your depth was never the problem. The problem was never your capacity to feel, to connect, or to love fully. The problem was the mismatch between what you offered and what the other system could consistently hold. And once you see that clearly, the conclusion becomes less about repair and more about direction. Not chasing understanding from people who cannot sustain it, but recognizing where mutual capacity actually exists. Because real connection is not defined by intensity in the beginning. It is defined by what remains steady when intensity becomes real. In conclusion, the deeper truth behind everything we've explored is not that you were too much, not that you were unlovable, and not that something about your presence caused love to disappear. The reality is far more complex, and at the same time far more freeing than the story most people end up carrying after such experiences. What you went through was the collision between genuine emotional depth and a nervous system that had learned, often long before you ever entered the picture, to treat that same depth as something dangerous. When closeness increased, it did not register as simple comfort or connection. It registered as overload. And when a system reaches overload, it does not pause to interpret meaning or intention. It reacts. It protects itself. It creates distance. It shuts down. It withdraws. Not because love is absent, but because the experience of love has crossed a threshold that feels emotionally unmanageable to the person receiving it. This is why the pattern feels so contradictory. The same connection that felt warm, real, and intimate in the beginning later becomes the very thing that triggers emotional withdrawal. The same bond that created closeness also activates fear. And in that internal conflict, fear tends to win. Not because it is stronger than love, but because it is older, more deeply conditioned, and more automatic. But understanding this does not mean minimizing your experience or excusing the impact it had on you. The confusion, the inconsistency, the emotional whiplash, and the sense of being pulled towards someone who was simultaneously pulling away, none of that is imagined. It is real, and it leaves real emotional consequences. The goal of understanding is not to soften that reality. The goal is to remove the false meaning that often gets attached to it. Because without this understanding, many people walk away believing something deeply damaging. That the moment they became fully seen, they became less lovable. That their depth pushed love away. That intimacy exposed a flaw in them, rather than a limitation in the other person's capacity to remain emotionally present. And that belief, more than the relationship itself, is what continues to cause harm long after the connection ends. The truth is that your depth did not create rejection. Your authenticity did not reduce your value. Your capacity to love did not become a liability the moment it was fully expressed. What happened instead is that your depth encountered a system that had not yet learned how to stay grounded inside depth without becoming overwhelmed by it. And that distinction changes everything. It moves the story away from self-blame and toward reality. It replaces the idea of "I was too much" with the more accurate understanding of this person's capacity reached its limit. It shifts the meaning from personal inadequacy to relational mismatch and nervous system conditioning. And in doing so, it restores something essential that the experience often takes away: trust in your own emotional legitimacy. At the same time, this understanding also brings responsibility, not for changing someone else, but for recognizing patterns as they are, not as you hope they could become. Because potential is not the same as presence, and insight into why someone behaves a certain way does not guarantee they are capable of behaving differently in a consistent, sustained way with you. Healing, then, is not found in trying to turn inconsistency into stability through endurance. It is found in learning to differentiate between connection that grows stronger over time and connection that destabilizes as it deepens. One builds trust, the other erodes it, regardless of the intensity that exists at the beginning. So the conclusion is not just psychological, it is directional. It is that you are not meant to shrink to fit someone else's nervous system limitations. You are not meant to reinterpret confusion as destiny. You are not meant to turn emotional inconsistency into a measure of your worth. And you are not meant to stay in dynamics where love and fear are so entangled that one continuously destroys the experience of the other. What you are meant for is connection, where presence does not collapse under depth, where consistency does not disappear when things become real, where love does not require you to question your own perception in order to maintain it. And that kind of connection is not rare because you are unworthy of it. It only feels rare when you have been standing too long in places where it could not survive. The most important shift now is not understanding the past more deeply, but refusing to carry its false conclusions forward. Because the moment you stop interpreting inconsistency as a reflection of your value, you begin to see something much clearer: that your capacity for depth was never the problem. It was always the invitation toward a connection that could finally meet it.